Hi, I'm Dan Connor with Sun & Products Company. I'm the manager of our technical center here at our headquarters in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm here today to introduce you to our Sun & PGE-6000 electronic dial bore gauge. The PGE-6000 is based on the legendary PGE-800 mechanical dial bore gauge. The PGE-6000 has the same diameter range as the PGE-800 gauge. One side of the gauge will measure from 370 thousandths to 740 thousandths. The other side of the gauge will measure from 740 thousandths to 1.5 inches. Upon startup of the gauge, it will always bring up a calibration option for you in the beginning. You have the option at this time to fully calibrate the gauge or to skip the calibration and go to your previous settings. I'm going to skip the calibration at this time. The PGE has the option to save all of your setups. The current setup that's active is shown in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, and that's your current setup. At this point, you have the option to retrieve another setup here under File. You can open existing saved setups, or you can start a new setup from scratch. We're going to walk through creating a new setup from scratch so I can show you step by step how that's done. I'm going to give the new setup a name at this time. So now I'm going to go through the setup and calibration of the gauge. At this point, you have 3 different tabs to the side. 2 of the tabs are red, meaning something needs to be completed or finished. The first is the initial setup. Under initial setup, you have 2 options. You can either use a setting fixture like the PGE-400 gauge, or you can use a ring gauge that is close to the finished diameter of your part. So you have those 2 options. In this demonstration, we're going to be using the setting fixture. So at this time, I'm going to enter the nominal part diameter. Of 859 thousandths. The next is your setting fixture size. Your setting fixture may or may not match the exact nominal size, so at this time you could enter whatever the setting fixture diameter is. My current setting fixture, the PGE-400, I have set to 700 thousandths on this side and 159 thousandths on the right side. So once I have that information in there, I'm going to go to the next tab, which is Settings. At that point, it will ask me to apply those settings. Under Settings is where you're going to enter if you want to have the readings in absolute or relative. And this is where you're going to set your upper and lower tolerance limits for your part. In the case of this, we currently have it set to plus or minus 0.5 of an inch. The next step is how many measurements do you want to take per part? You can take multiple measurements for one part. If you'd like to check both ends, check the middle, you can take each individual reading and record those individually. The next is the gauge data settings. This is how you're going to record that data and save it onto the gauge. In this case, there's none required. You also have the option to enter a serial number for every recording. So every time you measure a part and you hit record, it will prompt you to enter a serial number for that specific measurement. The last step is to use a batch number. This is where you're going to use a shop order or a work order number that is applied to all of the parts you're measuring. So each of the measurements you take will be recorded and associated with that shop order or work order number. The last step that's still red is to do the actual gauge calibration. The gauge calibration for the PGE-6000 is the same as a PGE-800, but the gauge will actually walk you through step by step how to do it. So now I'm going to put the PGE-400 onto the gauge. And the first step here is to adjust the gauge and lock. So this is where you're actually going to turn and adjust the fingers out until you get a reading. And what I'm looking for is the needle to come out to be in this green band on the gauge. See the gauge is starting to move up. Once I'm within the green range, anywhere within that range, I'm going to go ahead and lock the fixture down like you normally would, and I'm going to hit the continue button. So you can see over here that step is completed and checked. Now I'm going to go to the next step, which is align fixture. So in this case, I'm going to align the fixture with the level on top of the PG-400, and I'm looking for the highest positive reading. So once you're done and find the highest reading, you'll see the alignment done is now illuminated, and I can select that to go to the next step. At this point, the gauge prompts you to go ahead and remove the setting fixture. And to install a part, you can also use a ring gauge at this time. So I'm going to hit OK to go to the next step. So the last step here that we're looking to do is to centralize the gauge, just like you would on a standard PG-800 gauge. So with the part on there, we're going to use the centralizing lever, and we're looking for, again, the highest positive reading with the needle on here. And you can see now that the centralizing done is illuminated, and I can hit that button, and now the gauge calibration is complete. So now that we're at the measurement part of the gauge, we're going to go over the features and options that you have. So under the settings tab over here, you have multiple options you can choose based on your preferences of how you'd like to measure and how you'd like to view the parts. Okay, when we go to the settings, we have multiple options. The first is language. We have multiple languages that are programmed into the PG gauge. The next option is if you want to use English or metric. So in this case, I can select English or metric. So if I select metric, the gauge will instantly change to metric down here at the bottom of the gauge. The next option down is the font size, where you can change with the drop-down menu, you can change the font of the display. The option after that is how many decimal places you would like to display on the gauge. You have the option of 4, 5, or 6 decimal places that you can display. So by touching the sliding bar, you can change at the bottom of the gauge here. Right now we're showing 6 decimal places, and by touching that, I can go back and I can change how many decimal places are displayed on the gauge. The option underneath that, the linear digital gauge, is what we're displaying right now. Based on user preference, we can also change it to be a radial arc. So in this case, the gauge is displayed like this, and you can see the gauge needle is displayed more in this fashion. So you have those two options to be either a radial or a linear gauge based on your preferences. Underneath the linear and digital gauge is where you would select if you would like a relative or absolute reading. So all you have to do is select relative or absolute at this time to give you the reading at the bottom of the gauge to be shown in relative or absolute, again, based on the preference of how your operators or how you want the measurements to be taken. The next step, like a standard PG-800 gauge, uses green flags like this to show the tolerance zone of the part. So in this case, we have the green flags are shown at the top and the bottom of the tolerance for the part. You do have the option to turn those off if you like, where those now, the green flags are not displayed anymore. You also have the option below this then to make the entire tolerance zone for a good part to be shown in green. So you can see now the entire tolerance zone on the gauge is shown in green to make it more obvious. The next option has to do with lighting. Based on the lighting in your shop, you can choose the gauge to have a white or a black background. So at this time you can change it to have a black background like this. Again, it's just a preference for you, whether you like it to be a white or a black background, which is ever easier to see, you have that option. Then the very last option you have to pick from is the range that you want to show. At this time, we're showing a 5/1000th range of the gauge. We also have the option where we can show a total of 10/1000th range. So you can see now the gauge is still centered, the same tolerance, but now we're looking at an entire range of 10/1000ths of an inch. So based on your incoming stock, you can adjust that so you can show parts that are smaller than that. Now that we have our settings set how we'd like to look at the gauge, now we can start to take and record measurements. So all I have to do to record a measurement is to touch the screen. So as I put a part onto the gauge, you'll see the needle will come up. If you'll notice too, that the size down here in diameter also changes based on if the part is in tolerance or not. It will change from red to green to yellow and match the gauge over here so that it's easier to tell if the part is good or bad. So now that I have a part on the gauge and I'm taking a reading, once the reading settles, when I touch the screen now, you can see a number 1 has appeared over here and then slowly fades away. So that's actually taken at one measurement, one recorded measurement, and it has saved it to our setup file. So I can take another gear, I can put it on the gauge, touch the screen anywhere, and you can see now a number 2 has come up. So the number 2 is showing that I've recorded and saved 2 measurements for this part. So I'm going to take a few different readings, and we can save them so we can show what the part history looks like, and I'll show you that after. Now that I've taken 6 measurements, I can go and look at the history and kind of the trend of how the parts are measuring. So now I can go from the measuring tab here over to history and analysis. So here under history and analysis, it's going to display the part diameter. Each measurement you've taken is going to be recorded. It shows you a trend of the diameter. It shows the nominal size in the middle and then your upper and lower limits, along with green lines to kind of show you the range of where the parts are. So each of the individual 6 measurements I've taken are displayed here with a blue dot. And you can kind of see the trend followed by the pink line of kind of the trend of the part diameter. Next is under data management. So under data management, it shows you each of the individual readings. It shows you what the nominal size is and what the average size is. So if you took multiple measurements for one part, if you took 2 or 3 measurements, it's going to give you the average diameter for that part at this time. So next we have the data analysis. So this is where it shows you the data for the beginning sample and the end sample. It gives you all of the information here of the average, the median, the standard deviation, the min, and the max diameter. And it's showing here, start sample is 1, my end sample so far is 6. The last step would actually be to export the data. You have 2 different options to export. On the back of the gauge, you have a USB port and an Ethernet port. You can export the files via a USB, via a flash drive, or you can go direct to a computer via the Ethernet cable. In this case, I'm going to use a flash drive. So now that I have the file selected that I would like to export, all I need to do is go to Select Folder right here and select which directory I would like to put the file into and select OK. So now that's set up and the measurements I've taken have been exported to that directory. The files that are all exported are a CSV file, so they can all be opened through Excel or any kind of SPC software that you use. In order to switch the gauge from the smaller to the larger diameter side, you just undo the clamps on the side of the gauge. Once they're loosened, you can remove the gauge head and pivot the gauge around and set it back in place. Another nice feature of the gauge is you can actually operate the gauge with the gauge head separate from the mechanical portion at the bottom. So you could actually set the gauge head to the side on a bench or on a shelf to make it easier. This concludes the setup, the features, and the calibration of the PGE-6000. The PGE-6000 is available for sale or for lease. If you have any questions, please visit our website or call our toll-free number. Thank you for watching.